The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Crown Prince Alexander adjusted his ceremonial uniform one final time. The annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala was one of his most cherished events, and today marked the 10th anniversary of the foundation he and Princess Isabella had established together. Media crews from across the kingdom had gathered, their cameras positioned strategically around the grand ballroom where hundreds of guests awaited the royal couple's arrival. Isabella smoothed her emerald green gown and glanced at her husband with concern. Over the past few weeks, she had noticed subtle changes in Alexander's behavior. He seemed more tired than usual, often rubbing his temples during meetings, and twice she had found him sitting quietly in his study, staring out the window with an expression she couldn't quite read. When she asked if everything was all right, he would smile that familiar, reassuring smile and insist he was simply busy with upcoming state affairs. The palace corridors buzzed with activity as staff members made final preparations. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the couple's longtime private secretary, approached them with her tablet in hand, reviewing the day's schedule one more time. "Your Highnesses, the press conference begins in 15 minutes, followed by the charity presentation, and then the formal dinner. The children from St. Mary's Hospital are particularly excited to meet you both." Alexander nodded, though Isabella noticed a slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his ceremonial sword. She placed her gloved hand gently on his arm. "Are you certain you're feeling well enough for all of this? We could always postpone." "Absolutely not," Alexander interrupted, his voice carrying the authority that came with years of royal training. "These children have been looking forward to this day for months. I won't disappoint them because of a little fatigue." As they walked toward the ballroom, the sound of their footsteps echoed against the marble floors. Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Alexander's usual confident stride seemed slightly unsteady, and she noticed beads of perspiration on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the palace halls. The massive oak doors opened, and immediately the flash of cameras illuminated the grand ballroom. Hundreds of guests rose to their feet in respectful acknowledgement as the royal couple entered. Children in hospital gowns sat in the front rows, their faces bright with excitement and hope. The charity gala represented more than just fundraising. It was a beacon of hope for families facing unimaginable challenges. Alexander moved toward the podium with practiced grace, waving to the crowd and stopping to shake hands with several dignitaries. Isabella followed closely, her trained smile masking the growing anxiety she felt watching her husband. She had learned to read his subtle expressions after 15 years of marriage, and today, something was definitely not right. The Master of Ceremonies introduced the royal couple with flowery language about their dedication to charitable causes and their unwavering commitment to the kingdom's most vulnerable citizens. As applause filled the ornate ballroom, Alexander stepped up to the microphone, his hands gripping the edges of the wooden podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and most importantly, our brave young friends from the hospital," Alexander began, his voice strong and clear. 10 years ago, Princess Isabella and I had a simple dream: to ensure that every child in our kingdom would have access to the medical care and support they need to thrive." Isabella stood to his left, nodding encouragingly as he spoke. She noticed his knuckles were white from gripping the podium so tightly, and a thin line of perspiration had formed along his hairline. The ballroom was warm with so many people, she reasoned, trying to calm her growing concern. "Today, I'm proud to announce that our foundation has raised over £5 million this year alone," Alexander continued, pausing as the audience erupted in enthusiastic applause. "This money will directly fund new pediatric equipment, research programs, and support services for families during their most difficult times." As he spoke about the Foundation's achievements, Alexander's voice began to sound slightly strained. Isabella stepped closer, pretending to adjust the microphone while actually positioning herself to offer support if needed. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of what appeared to be another successful royal engagement. "We've seen miracles happen within these hospital walls," Alexander said, his eyes finding several children in the front row. "We've witnessed the incredible strength of young spirits who refuse to give up, and the dedication of medical professionals who work tirelessly to give hope where there once was none." The audience was completely captivated by his words, but Isabella noticed that Alexander's breathing seemed labored. He paused longer than usual between sentences, and his left hand had begun to shake slightly. She caught the eye of their head of security, James Morrison, who stood near the side entrance. His expression immediately became more alert as he recognized her subtle signal. "The children we serve remind us every day that courage isn't the absence of fear," Alexander continued, though his voice now carried a slight tremor. "It's moving forward despite that fear, facing each day with hope and determination." Isabella's heart began racing as she watched her husband struggle to maintain his composure. The color had drained from his face, and she could see him fighting to stay focused. The massive chandelier above seemed to cast strange shadows, and the faces in the crowd appeared to blur together. "As we look toward the future," Alexander said, his words beginning to slur almost imperceptibly, "we must remember that every child deserves the chance to dream, to grow, and to contribute to our society." The room fell silent as Alexander suddenly stopped speaking mid-sentence. His grip on the podium tightened, and Isabella saw pure panic flash across his features. The confident prince, who had addressed parliaments and world leaders, was struggling to remember what he wanted to say next. "The foundation," he began again, but his voice trailed off. Beads of sweat were now clearly visible on his forehead, and his breathing had become noticeably shallow. Isabella stepped forward instinctively, her hand reaching toward his arm, but Alexander straightened and forced himself to continue. "The foundation represents hope," he managed, though everyone in the room could sense that something was wrong. In the front row, 8-year-old Emma Thompson, a patient from the children's ward, looked up at the prince with innocent concern. She had been battling leukemia for 2 years, and had been particularly excited to meet the royal couple who had funded her treatment program. Her mother, Sarah, noticed the change in the prince's demeanor and instinctively pulled her daughter closer. The cameras continued recording, their operators unsure whether to continue filming or stop. This was supposed to be a celebration, a moment of triumph for the royal foundation. But something was clearly happening that went far beyond a simple case of nerves or fatigue. Alexander's vision began to blur as he looked out at the sea of faces before him. The ornate ballroom, with its gold-leafed walls and crystal chandeliers, started to spin slowly around him. He could hear Isabella saying something to him, but her voice seemed to come from very far away, as if he were hearing her through water. "Ladies and gentlemen," Isabella suddenly said, stepping up to the microphone with remarkable composure, "I believe my husband would like to take a brief moment to greet some of our young guests personally before we continue with the formal presentations." It was a masterful attempt to create a natural break in the program, but those closest to the stage could see that something was seriously wrong. Alexander's hand had begun trembling more noticeably, and his eyes seemed unfocused despite his efforts to maintain eye contact with the audience. James Morrison moved closer to the stage, speaking quietly into his earpiece to alert the medical team that was always on standby during royal events. Dr. Richard Hayes, the palace physician, was already making his way through the crowd, though he tried to appear casual to avoid alarming the guests. Alexander turned to face Isabella, and in that moment, she saw fear in his eyes, not the controlled concern of a public figure managing a difficult situation, but genuine, raw fear. He opened his mouth to speak to her privately, but no words came out. The last thing Alexander remembered clearly was the sound of children's laughter echoing through the ballroom and the feeling of Isabella's hand reaching for his as everything around him began to fade into darkness. The ballroom erupted into chaos as Crown Prince Alexander's knees buckled and he collapsed behind the podium. Isabella's scream pierced through the stunned silence that had fallen over the crowd for just a split second before panic set in. Her emerald gown rustled as she dropped to the floor beside her husband, her hands trembling as she tried to check his pulse while calling his name desperately. "Alexander! Alexander! Can you hear me?" Her voice cracked with terror as she cradled his head in her lap. His face was pale and his breathing shallow, but his eyes were closed and he remained completely unresponsive. The confident, strong man who had been addressing the crowd moments before now lay motionless on the marble platform. James Morrison was the first to reach them, his training immediately taking over as he barked orders into his earpiece. "Medical emergency at the podium. Clear the ballroom immediately. I repeat, clear the ballroom now." His voice carried the authority of someone who had prepared for every possible scenario except this one. Dr. Richard Hayes pushed through the crowd, his medical bag already in hand. He had been attending royal events for over 20 years, but nothing had prepared him for seeing the future king of the realm unconscious on the floor. "Your Highness, please step back slightly so I can examine him," he said gently to Isabella, though she seemed unable to let go of her husband's hand. The guests stood frozen in shock for several moments before staff members began ushering them toward the exits. The children from the hospital looked confused and frightened, unsure of what was happening to the prince who had just been speaking to them about hope and courage. Emma Thompson began crying, and her mother swept her up in her arms while trying to shield her from the disturbing scene. "Everyone please remain calm and exit through the side doors," announced Lady Margaret Thornfield, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding before her. She had managed royal crises before, but nothing of this magnitude. "The event will be postponed. Please follow the staff members who will guide you safely outside." Dr. Hayes knelt beside Alexander and immediately began checking his vital signs. His pulse was weak and irregular, and his breathing remained dangerously shallow. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately," he told Morrison. "This isn't exhaustion or stress. Something is seriously wrong." Isabella's tears began flowing freely as she watched the doctor work. Her carefully applied makeup ran down her cheeks, but she was completely unaware of anything except her husband's motionless form. "Is he going to be okay? Please tell me he's going to be okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the commotion in the ballroom. "I don't know yet, Your Highness," Dr. Hayes replied honestly. "His symptoms suggest a possible neurological episode, but I need to run proper tests to determine the cause. We need to move him now." The palace's emergency medical team arrived with a stretcher, and the sight of medical professionals rushing to save the crown prince created an image that would be seared into the memory of everyone present. Isabella refused to leave Alexander's side as they carefully transferred him to the stretcher, her hand never releasing his even as they began wheeling him toward the ambulance that had been called to the palace courtyard. Camera crews who had been filming the charity event found themselves documenting a royal medical emergency instead. Some continued recording while others stopped out of respect, unsure of the proper protocol for such an unprecedented situation. The footage would later be analyzed frame by medical experts and royal watchers trying to understand what had happened to the seemingly healthy 38-year-old prince. As they moved through the palace corridors, Isabella walked alongside the stretcher, her heels clicking frantically against the marble floors. She could hear Dr. Hayes speaking into his phone, using medical terminology she didn't understand, but that sounded urgent and concerning. Words like possible stroke and immediate intervention made her stomach clench with terror. "Your Highness," James Morrison said gently as they approached the ambulance, I think it would be best if you rode in the security vehicle behind the ambulance. The medical team needs space to work during transport." "No," Isabella said firmly, her tears still flowing but her voice gaining strength. "I'm riding with him. I don't care about protocol or procedures. He's my husband, and I'm not leaving his side." Dr. Hayes looked up from adjusting the portable oxygen mask over Alexander's face. "Your Highness, there really isn't much room, and we may need to perform emergency procedures during transport." Isabella's eyes flashed with a determination that reminded everyone present why she had been considered a perfect match for the strong-willed crown prince. "Then you'll have to work around me because I'm not leaving him. If something happens—" Her voice broke slightly. "If something happens, I need to be there." The ambulance ride to Royal Victoria Hospital felt like the longest 20 minutes of Isabella's life. She sat pressed against the side wall, holding Alexander's hand while Dr. Hayes and a paramedic monitored his condition. The sirens wailed through the streets of the capital, and she could see people stopping on sidewalks and looking up at the emergency vehicles with curiosity and concern. Alexander remained unconscious throughout the journey, though his breathing seemed to stabilize slightly with the oxygen assistance. Dr. Hayes checked his pupils repeatedly with a small flashlight, muttering observations to the paramedic that Isabella strained to understand. She found herself studying every line of her husband's face, memorizing details she had looked at thousands of times but suddenly feared she might lose. When they arrived at the hospital, Isabella was overwhelmed by the organized chaos that erupted around them. Medical staff who had been alerted to expect the Crown Prince were ready with equipment and expertise, but seeing the future king of the realm unconscious on a stretcher was jarring even for experienced emergency room professionals. "Dr. Sarah Mitchell will be taking over his care," Dr. Hayes explained to Isabella as they transferred Alexander to a hospital bed. "She's our head of neurology and one of the finest doctors in the country. Your Highness, they're going to need to run several tests immediately, including an MRI and blood work." Isabella nodded numbly, still clutching Alexander's hand. Dr. Mitchell, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an air of competence, approached them with a gentle but professional manner. "Your Highness, I need to ask you some questions about the prince's recent health and behavior. Any information you can provide might help us determine what's happening." "He's been tired lately," Isabella began, her voice shaking as she tried to remember every detail. "More tired than usual, and he's been having headaches. I asked him about it, but he insisted it was just stress from upcoming state visits. He's always been so strong, so healthy. We go running together most mornings, and he seemed fine." Dr. Mitchell made notes as Isabella spoke, occasionally asking follow-up questions about Alexander's family medical history and recent activities. The prince's unconscious form lay between them, connected to monitors that beeped rhythmically and provided the only sound in the increasingly sterile environment. "Has he had any vision problems? Difficulty finding words or speaking? Any weakness in his limbs?" Dr. Mitchell asked. Isabella thought back to the morning's events and earlier weeks. "Now that you mention it, yesterday he seemed to have trouble reading a briefing document. He kept squinting and moving it closer to his face. But when I asked about it, he said the print was just small. And this morning, getting dressed, he seemed to fumble with his cufflinks more than usual." The doctor's expression became more serious as she processed this information. "We're going to take him for an MRI now. The scan will help us see what's happening in his brain. I know this is terrifying, but we're going to do everything we can to help him." As they wheeled Alexander toward the imaging department, Isabella found herself in a hospital waiting room for the first time in her adult life. The fluorescent lights seemed harsh after the elegant chandeliers of the palace, and the plastic chairs felt cold and unwelcoming. She sat alone, her elaborate gown completely out of place in the clinical environment, and for the first time since becoming a member of the royal family, she felt utterly powerless. James Morrison sat nearby, coordinating with palace officials and managing the growing media attention outside the hospital. News of the Crown Prince's collapse had already reached the public, and crowds were beginning to gather outside the medical facility. The gravity of the situation was becoming clear to everyone involved. The future of the monarchy hung in the balance while Alexander fought for his life just rooms away. Isabella's phone buzzed constantly with calls from family members, government officials, and palace staff, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. Speaking about what was happening would make it real in a way she wasn't ready to accept. Instead, she sat in the uncomfortable chair, staring at the closed doors that separated her from her husband, and prayed to whatever forces might be listening that this nightmare would end with Alexander opening his eyes and smiling at her the way he had on their wedding day. The waiting continued, each minute feeling like an hour, as Isabella clung to hope and tried to prepare herself for whatever devastating news might emerge from the medical tests being performed on the man she loved more than life itself. 3 hours passed in the sterile waiting room before Dr. Mitchell finally emerged from the imaging department, her expression carefully neutral, but carrying the weight of significant news. Isabella stood immediately, her legs unsteady after hours of anxious sitting, her once perfect appearance now disheveled from stress and tears. "Your Highness, please sit down," Dr. Mitchell said gently, pulling up a chair to face Isabella directly. "I have the results of Prince Alexander's tests, and I need to explain what we found." Isabella's heart hammered against her chest as she lowered herself back into the plastic chair. James Morrison moved closer, ready to provide support for whatever news was about to change everything. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, creating an almost surreal atmosphere for a conversation that would define the rest of their lives. "The MRI shows that Prince Alexander has suffered a brain aneurysm," Dr. Mitchell began, her voice professional but compassionate. "It's a weakness in the blood vessel wall that has caused bleeding in his brain. The good news is that we caught it before it ruptured completely, which likely saved his life." Isabella felt the world tilt around her as she processed the doctor's words. Brain aneurysm. The phrase seemed to echo in her mind as she struggled to understand the implications. What does that mean? Is he going to be okay? Can you fix it? Dr. Mitchell leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact with Isabella. Aneurysms are serious, but they can often be treated successfully. Prince Alexander will need immediate surgery to repair the weakened blood vessel and stop the bleeding. It's a delicate procedure, but our neurosurgical team has extensive experience with these cases. "How long will the surgery take?" Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "When can I see him?" "The procedure could take anywhere from 4 to 8 hours, depending on the complexity of the repair," Dr. Mitchell explained. "Prince Alexander is being prepared for surgery now. You can see him briefly before he's taken to the operating room, but he's still unconscious." Isabella stood on trembling legs, smoothing her wrinkled gown with nervous hands. "Yes, please. I need to see him." The intensive care unit felt like another world entirely, filled with monitors and machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical precision. Alexander lay in the hospital bed, looking pale and vulnerable in a way Isabella had never seen before. The strong, confident prince who commanded respect in state meetings and charmed world leaders was now connected to tubes and wires that seemed to dwarf his unconscious form. Isabella approached the bed slowly, afraid that even her footsteps might disturb him. She took his hand in hers, noting how cold it felt compared to his usual warmth. His face was peaceful, almost as if he were simply taking a nap after a long day of royal duties, but the medical equipment surrounding him told a different story. "I'm here," she whispered, leaning close to his ear. "I'm not going anywhere. The doctors are going to take good care of you, and when you wake up, I'll be right here waiting." Her tears began flowing again, dropping onto their joined hands. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the lead neurosurgeon, appeared beside the bed wearing surgical scrubs and projecting an air of calm competence. She had performed hundreds of similar procedures, but the weight of operating on the future king of the realm was not lost on her. "Your Highness, I wanted to speak with you before we begin," Dr. Chen said. "I've reviewed Prince Alexander's scans thoroughly, and while this is certainly serious, I'm optimistic about our ability to repair the aneurysm successfully. He's young, healthy, and the bleeding appears to be contained." Isabella looked up from Alexander's face, her eyes red from crying but showing the strength that had made her a beloved member of the royal family. "What are the risks? I need to know everything." Dr. Chen appreciated the directness of the question. "With any brain surgery, there are risks of stroke, infection, or complications from anesthesia. In Prince Alexander's specific case, there's also a possibility of temporary memory issues or speech difficulties as he recovers. However, given the location and size of the aneurysm, I believe the chances of a full recovery are very good." "How long will his recovery take?" Isabella asked, already thinking about the countless royal obligations and state functions that would need to be managed during Alexander's absence. "If the surgery goes well, he could wake up within a few hours afterward," Dr. Chen explained. "However, full recovery from brain surgery typically takes several months. He'll need extensive rest, physical therapy, and a gradual return to normal activities. Royal duties would need to be significantly reduced for at least 6 months." Isabella nodded, understanding that Alexander's health was infinitely more important than any ceremonial function or state dinner. "Thank you for being honest with me. Please, take good care of him." As the medical team prepared to wheel Alexander to surgery, Isabella leaned down and kissed his forehead gently. "I love you," she whispered. "Come back to me." The operating room doors closed behind the surgical team, leaving Isabella alone once again in the waiting area. This time, however, she was joined by Alexander's parents, King Edward and Queen Margaret, who had rushed to the hospital upon hearing the news. The elderly monarchs looked shaken and frail, suddenly appearing every one of their 70-plus years. "Isabella, my dear," Queen Margaret said, embracing her daughter-in-law with tears streaming down her face. "How is he? What exactly happened?" Isabella recounted the morning's events, from Alexander's subtle signs of illness to his dramatic collapse during the charity speech. King Edward listened with the stoic expression he had perfected during decades of royal duties, but Isabella could see the fear and love for his son beneath the composed exterior. "The Foundation Gala seems so unimportant now," Isabella reflected, thinking about the children who had been waiting to meet their royal patrons. All those people, all that preparation, and none of it matters compared to Alexander's health. Queen Margaret took Isabella's hand in her weathered one. "The work you and Alexander do together matters enormously, dear. Those children need hope and support now more than ever. But right now, the most important thing is getting our boy healthy again." Hours passed with agonizing slowness as the royal family waited for news from the operating room. Palace officials came and went, updating them on media coverage and public reaction to the prince's medical emergency. The entire kingdom seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for word about their future king's condition. Outside the hospital, hundreds of people had gathered to show their support for the royal family. Flowers, cards, and small gifts were left at the hospital entrance, creating an impromptu memorial of love and concern. Local news crews provided continuous coverage, interviewing royal experts and medical professionals about brain aneurysms and surgical procedures. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was actually 6 hours, Dr. Chen emerged from the operating room, still wearing her surgical scrubs, but with a cautiously optimistic expression. Isabella, King Edward, and Queen Margaret immediately surrounded her, desperate for any news about Alexander's condition. "The surgery was successful," Dr. Chen announced. and Isabella felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. "We were able to repair the aneurysm completely, and the bleeding has stopped. Prince Alexander is being moved to the intensive care unit now, and he should wake up within the next few hours." Isabella's tears of fear finally transformed into tears of joy and relief. "Can I see him? Is he going to be okay?" "He's going to need time to recover, and we'll be monitoring him closely for the next several days," Dr. Chen cautioned. "But all indications are positive. The prince is strong and his body responded well to the procedure." When Isabella was finally allowed back into the ICU, Alexander's eyes were closed, but his breathing was steady and natural. The color had returned to his face, and he looked more like himself, despite the bandages and medical equipment. She took his hand again and felt warmth returning to his fingers. "The hardest part is over," she whispered to him. "Now, we just focus on getting you better." As if responding to her voice, Alexander's eyelids fluttered slightly. Isabella held her breath, hoping desperately for any sign that her husband was returning to consciousness. After several moments, his eyes opened slowly and focused on her face. "Isabella," he said in a weak but clear voice, "what happened? Where are we?" The tears that Isabella had been holding back throughout the long, terrifying day finally overwhelmed her completely. But now they were tears of pure joy and overwhelming relief. "You're safe," she managed to say through her sobs. "You're going to be fine. I love you so much." Alexander squeezed her hand weakly, his confused expression gradually clearing as he became more aware of his surroundings. The journey back to full health would be long and challenging, but in this moment, with her husband's eyes open and his voice speaking her name, Isabella knew that everything was going to be all right. The prince who had collapsed before cameras that morning was going to live, love, and serve his kingdom for many years to come, and Isabella would be right beside him every step of the way.